All right. Well, Brett, thank you for joining me. Obviously, these are really unique times, so thrilled to get your perspective on the real estate industry and in particular just how this COVID-19 crisis changes some of the imperatives for technology adoption and how you're thinking about it from Cushman's perspective.
Sure.
So why don't I just start with kind of a question I've been thinking a lot about, which is, for the last 3-4 years, real estate owners have talked a lot about this need for smarter buildings or kind of tech-enabled buildings that have the ability to just understand how occupants are using them. And I'm curious to get your view on, do you think the COVID crisis puts an even greater emphasis on that, both in terms of understanding how people are, accessing your buildings, but then also the kind of public health dynamics around that? How do you think that impacts mainly office owners in particular?
Yeah, so look, I start with a view that I think we can all agree on very quickly, that this particular crisis has taken what has been an evolution in prop tech, an evolution in the way people work in the built environment that may have taken 5, 6, 7 more years to accomplish, and it's compressed it into 4 or 5 weeks. So we've learned more about the way people work remotely, the way our clients, employees work remotely in the last month than I think we would have learned, as I mentioned, in years. And so that has manifested itself in a lot of different ways. Later on we can talk about how people are actually going to work going forward. But as pertains to technology in buildings, and particularly an office owner's technology, I think a lot of things are going to be different immediately. Some of those will stay, I think, forever, and others may go away once this particular pandemic has a vaccine that's widely distributed. So for instance, it is highly likely that part of the protocol to access an office building in a month and a half or 2 months will include some sort of temperature check. And it is not complicated, nor is it expensive, to take the access panel we swipe our card on and include in that some sort of infrared temperature sensor. And so when you think about how our building owner is going to assure tenants in a multi-tenant building that the building's safe, part of that protocol is going to have to involve some sort of health check. Yeah. And so when you think about how that's going to work long term, I could see that building access systems could change very, very quickly to accommodate some of these protocols that we didn't need before. And maybe one way to think about it, Brendan, is pre-9/11, there was no TSA. There was no body scanning machines in airports. None of those protocols existed. Post 9/11, they were all put in, and now today they're dial toned to us. We barely, they're annoyance, but we barely notice them. And I think buildings are going to have to develop their own TSA type protocol to ensure a safe environment for employees. So the technology that goes into buildings, the way in which buildings can keep track of people, however they can do that, and the way in which they can use the technology that either exists today or could be efficiently added on to buildings to help with that sort of health tracking, I think are some of the things we'll see pretty quickly.
It's interesting, I was actually in Singapore in early February. And so, they were much earlier than the US in their exposure to this. And I remember when I was going about my meetings, I would have to actually sign a declaration whenever I entered a building saying I had not been into China. And in more than a few of the buildings, I noticed they had facial recognition technology. Mm-hmm. And so obviously I was a guest, so it wasn't working for me, but I saw many people just walking through the turnstiles. And so one of the interesting things is this interplay between privacy, right? So people have real, genuine concerns about facial recognition, but also the public health benefits of that data. If you can imagine, if someone came down with symptoms of COVID or tested positive for it, the ability for a real estate owner to help a tenant reverse engineer everyone that they came into contact with could be really profound. And just thinking just about touching less surfaces, without control, the fewer surfaces you touch over the course of a day, the safer you are. Right. So I think there's such profound implications for this.
Well, there are, and it's, one of the challenges we're going to have here in the States and in Western Europe is we don't have our personal freedoms make it more difficult to create some of these protocols. So for instance, We just finished moving, if you can imagine this, almost 1 million people back into office buildings in Greater China, where we manage 800 million square feet of buildings. So 1 million people we've now moved from home, our customers, back into these buildings. And the protocols that were developed in that 800 million square feet are rigid and they work, but some of them could be challenged here. So for example, what do we do in an office building in Midtown if someone comes to the building, one of the tenant's employees comes to the building and refuses to have their temperature checked? Do we actually have a legal right to say they can't have access to the building? Do we actually have a legal right to every single day register that employee, register that they filled out the health form, and that they got their temperature checked? I don't know the answer to those questions, but I can see that we are going to have challenges here, because for us, the easy solution for us helping put America back to work and Europe back to work was to take that 200-page playbook that we just developed in China, translate it, and hand it to every one of our owners and every one of our tenants and say, this is it. It's already done. It's been battle tested. Challenge is, there are elements of those protocols that we are not sure we are actually allowed to implement. So.
Right. It's interesting, as I've been kind of studying how different states, different cities have reacted to this crisis. And obviously the stay-at-home orders vary quite a bit. And what the federal government is saying something different. And you can almost push that down to a very granular level of individual assets. So there are stores that have refused to close, even though the landlords have said you need to close the assets. And the local jurisdictions have said all retail needs to be closed, or all buildings need to be closed. And so it's interesting. It almost kind of, it pushes a responsibility on real estate owners to have a public health point of view and kind of accept a certain responsibility that I think they never had to really contemplate before. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, both internationally in places like China, but obviously in the US, and between kind of red states and blue states, and the over kind of the layers of personal freedom that come on top of that.
Well, you can see these two dynamics that are in contrast or in opposition to one another. On the one hand, if you and I think about what would make an office building, a multi-tenant office building, or for that matter, an apartment project most attractive to us as a tenant, what would make it most attractive to us from a public health safety standpoint are the most rigid possible rules,
like
right? So
total command and control from the
right. Surveillance, everything, right? To say, I can tell you as a tenant, Brendan, that if you're going to be a tenant in my office building, we do 100 things to make sure no one comes in here sick. But that is in direct opposition to the whole concept of personal freedom. And I think in the US, we're going to have the additional challenge, which is, I wish the federal government would take our playbook or somebody's playbook and say, this is the program. This is what all office buildings, all retail centers, all restaurants have to do. They're not going to do that. So what's going to end up happening is you're going to have jurisdictional differences between what proper protocol is. To your point, whether it's red state, blue state, or whatever it may be, I'm afraid that we're going to end up with different protocols in different states, counties, and cities. Already California, has very different protocols around what tenants can and can't do on rent forbearance as compared to other states. And this is going to be challenging.
And that's going to be even harder, I imagine, for tenants that have these footprints in many different cities, many different states, many different countries, right, to protect the health of their employees. So I'm curious, of switching gears a little bit, but on a related topic. Obviously, you and I are both working from home, and a large part of the whole US is. And to some extent, I've been surprised at the ease with which my company has transitioned to a kind of work remote environment. I'd say initially there was some loss in productivity, but I've been just shocked by how efficiently we're working. And I imagine many other CEOs are as well. And so before the COVID-19 crisis, there already was, this kind of these themes and these trends within the real estate community that actually large companies might be changing the footprints and the formats of their offices. They want more flexible office space. They want people to be able to work from multiple different offices. And like broadly, I think of that as like flex office, right? People often kind of conflate like co-working with flex office as the trend, but flex office is kind of a juggernaut of a trend that's impacting office. To what extent do you think COVID will accelerate the demand for flex office space in the US?
Well, I think before I answer the question on flex office, I would start by saying this, which is every large employer, well, every small employer right now is experiencing what it means to have a mandated remote workforce, right? So the way I think about that is this is binary. It wasn't, hey, we're going to experiment with this group over here. It's everybody now is working remotely. And I think that has taught us very quickly that productivity remote may not be that different than productivity in the office. We do an Exco call every morning with my executive team. We have guest speakers come in every day. You are our first speaker, Brennan. Thank you for that. We've had a couple Fortune 500 CEOs on the last couple of days. One today employs 200,000 people around the world, in 100% of it's in office space, big company. And he made a few comments that were interesting. He said, first of all, they can track productivity because they bill by the hour. So it's an engineering firm. So he said, we can actually track productivity daily by the billing that gets done to put into their system. And he said, our productivity decline across the portfolio is 80 bips. It's less than 1% with our workforce being remote. And he said, so what we're concluding is it'll be a slow evolution because of the nature of the length of our leases, but we think we can have a component of our workforce never come back, that they're happier, better quality of life at home. The average commute's an hour either way in major cities in the US. That's for everybody, an hour either way. So he said, we think some of this may never come back. As it pertains to co-working, so co-working has been now faced with the extreme downside that we all talked about and thought about as, say, WeWork was building, which is what happens when companies want to shed space. Do they shed the co-working first, or do they shed it last? Adam's view was always they shed it last. I think most of our view was they shed it first. So we're going to see this play out a bit, but this particular pandemic has created a challenge for co-work that none of us contemplated, which is the whole idea of rubbing shoulders and being close to other workers is now verboten, right?
Yeah.
The new protocol is the 6-foot work environment. And so I think what's going to happen, Brendan, is very, very shortly, large occupiers are going to go into these offices before their people come back. They're going to rearrange desks. They're going to rearrange things to make sure that those social distancing separations are in place when their people go back to work. And I think that for co-working, this is a particular challenge because those spaces generally are not conducive to that. The long bench with the seats on it, the couches, and this just doesn't really work well in this particular point in time. So I think for co-working, that's the immediate issue, which is, does the space spatially work? The second issue is, I think for co-working is, how many of their tenants are small businesses that won't be able to survive this pandemic or are so stressed that they decide to go back and work at home and not pay rent? We don't know the answers to those questions yet. Now, the other side of the coin for co-working is that, I'll give you an example. The CEO we were talking to today with the 200,000 employees, he said, look, co-working may be an opportunity for us because we think of it as flex surge space, right? If I've got 10,000 employees that are working from home that are engineers, but I need to get them on a project somewhere for a year, that may be our best option, so long as that co-working provider can lay the space out that meets our new specifications for 6-foot distancing.
Yeah, and I mean, there's almost like two questions that are afoot for the co-working industry. The first is just, do the existing operators survive, right? Because I think, any economic historian knows, like when you have this mismatch in the duration of your assets and your liabilities, all it takes is something like this to precipitate a kind of very quick unwinding of that business. And to some extent, that might almost throw the baby out with the bathwater, that a lot of the operators might themselves contract, but it might distract people from really understanding the trends. Because I agree with you, there's almost this demand for truly flex space, like flexible space that a company can use, that is a company's almost property, right? It is their space.
Right.
And that's oftentimes conflated with co-working, this idea of, rubbing shoulders with lots of startups
Right.
in this really dense environment where you're all sharing beer and coffee. And I think some of the trends might be missed, but I'd be really curious to hear the conclusion on what do companies cut first. Because I think probably no one knows the answer. It's too early at this point.
I think I would be very surprised if large companies who took some co-work space the last 3 years, I'd be very surprised with those companies who are going to reduce footprint. I would be very surprised if it wasn't the co-working component, simply for the obvious reasons, which is it's the only lease they have that they can cut because it has a shorter duration, right?
Right.
IBM isn't going to walk away from a lease with Heinz.
Yeah.
But if they have a 12-month lease in a WeWork building and they need to cut footprint, I think it's almost certain that's where they go.
Yeah. And I imagine a lot of landlords now are looking at some of the operators that are in their buildings and say, do I want to take this over? Do I want to be in the business of managing this space and marketing all of these SMB tenants that I never used to have to market for? Do I really want to be in the business of buying coffee, buying beer for tenants? So it'll be interesting to see that reaction.
There's an interesting question to that, which is, I don't know the answer to, something I thought about a few days ago, was if I'm an owner of an office building, let's use Heinz as our example, and let's imagine that one of the co-working operators is in my building. And that co-working operator comes to me and says, I don't want to pay rent for 6 months, but I'll stay here. And that owner has to make a decision. Is it better to work with this operator bird in the hand, or is it better to let them go? One of the things that's interesting to me is I'm not sure what happens if the operator goes away. Does that building owner actually inherit a footprint, a space that's actually leased out to these tenants? So they then operate it, right? Without having to go out and find tenants for it. Those tenants, I don't think, leave just because the operator of the space goes away. Those tenants are still there. And so one of the things, I think the calculus that owners are probably going through is, what are my options if my co-working operator tenant comes to me and wants to play hardball? I think owners have options.
Yeah. I'm curious to get also your view on, one of the things we've talked about is, what do you think the long-term effect will be on retail? And I know that there's a lot to unpack there, because we could have had this conversation 6 months ago, and to some extent it might be just as valid in a pre or post-COVID environment. And it just almost feels like the COVID-19 crisis accelerated many of the trends that were already gestating for a while in the retail industry. But before going deep on it, like, what do you think the retail industry looks like, say, 24 months from today?
Well, using the analogy we started with, which is we've taken what was an evolution in retail that would have taken, I don't know how long it would have taken, but it would be years. We've now compressed that to a month. And so as this tide goes out, I think the first thing that we can agree on is there were a number of legacy retailers that were on, to use a very poor analogy, life support. And this pandemic has turned off that life support. So those firms that were already struggling mightily to figure out what their new model was going to be may now be in a situation where that period of time they had to figure that out is now gone. And so I suspect the first thing we're going to see is some very large legacy retailers go away, and more quickly than they might have without this pandemic. I think that we will also see in retail, retailers that had developed new concepts and concepts that were successful being even more successful. there's this, it's the tide went out and the strong survive and the weak go away. And that's nowhere is that more true than retail. But the thing about retail, you always have to keep in mind, and you know this, is there is no vertical in commercial real estate that is more creative, that is more adaptive, that can change more quickly than retail, because that is their business. They're constantly having to change to different consumer tastes and buying patterns. Now they're having to change for this new event, which is how do we have an environment in our bricks and mortar stores that is safe for a customer to visit and can thrive in an environment like this. And so I don't know what those models are, but I know that those are the retailers that are going to win here. And you know, Brendan, you mentioned this the other day. Look, 85% of consumer goods in the U.S. were still bought bricks and mortar. 15% were e-commerce. E-commerce is certainly those numbers are going to jump in 2020. People, not only because they had to buy e-commerce the last 4 weeks, but because many people who had not done it before or had done little of it have found the channels available in e-commerce were much more broad than they thought they were, much more choice than they thought they had, and easier to use than they thought. So look, retail, the way I think about retail is this is the turning off of the live support. The big moves I think we're going to see this year are these a few very large legacy retailers go away.
And how do you think about, just, you know, from your business's standpoint, is if you think about the large kind of the scale retailers disappearing, what's so scary about retail is how systemic the problem could be, because, you know, foot traffic from consumers translates into sales, that basically translates into income for the retailers, a percent of which they ultimately pay landlords. But if suddenly some of those things start evaporating, the foot traffic, the tenant themselves, you fire these co-tenancy clauses that are in a lot of these retail leases and foot traffic clauses, and a lot of otherwise viable retail assets could be like vacated very fast. It's almost like, as I think about it, it's like a sudden surge is the big problem. It's almost like a flattening of the curve you want to affect for these large retailers. So you're right that I think many of the retailers we know today, the kind of old established brands, they were on life support, but at the same time, we don't want them to die artificially fast or kind of unnatural deaths. So like the fear is that you kill the otherwise viable retailers because everything becomes so systemic instantly. And once it becomes systemic, the capital markets freeze up. At the same time, sentiment shifts. And you also have the issue of all the debt holders, right? The mortgages on a lot of these assets are dependent on that. So
when you look at retail, you know, in the olden days, so maybe more than 10 years ago, the concept for big retail was, I'm going to seed my center, anchor my center with a couple different types of retailers to create the foot traffic to feed the others. And those were theaters and big box retail, the Robinsons, the May Company, the Sears, the Nordstrom. Those two operators, the theater and those big boxes, brought the foot traffic that fed the retailers you're talking about, the up and coming, exciting new retailers that took 1,200 square feet instead of 100,000 square feet. So if you extrapolate that out to today, one of the things that I think is getting pretty obvious is those retail centers that today were built and are successful because, and they don't rely on big box retailers or theaters for the foot traffic. They have an experiential value add. We want to go walk around that center because it's fun to walk around that center. Those would seem to me to be clear winners. And those centers that are anchored by the big boxes and perhaps theaters, riskier.
Yeah, and I've heard obviously of a lot of retail landlords building these precincts for digitally native brands. And like you said, the dynamic had kind of shifted where it used to be at the big boxes grew the foot traffic, and then inline retailers kind of captured that. But to some extent, I don't want to mention any specific names. I don't think a lot of people want to visit the big box retailers anymore, especially nowadays. But at the same time, I think the way some of these brands have built their stores to be really experiential and immersive in the brand, basically getting things you can't get online. I could see that still attracting certainly the younger demographic that has come to know those brands.
Yeah.
And do you think it changes almost the footprint then of certain retail assets? Do you think a lot of these big boxes just altogether go away, and are they repurposed into other use cases? I mean, we've talked a lot about, is co-working, right? Or is flex office a great use case for a big box in a retail mall? What do you think? Do you think the form factor changes?
It's yes. I think that the days of a large retail center being successful because everyone is going there to shop at this one big box, and then they would walk by the other, that was the layout scheme, right? Was the parking's over here, the big box is over here, and you got to walk across to all the little retailers to get there, or the theater. I do think that it's in today's retail environment, those big box retailers have much less of a value add, or said differently, are much less attractive to the consumer. The reason they're getting out of the house isn't to go to those retailers. So for those retailers, the work they have ahead of them is just multiples of what the small retailers have ahead of them, which is how do they repurpose or reformat their retail environment so that people again see what they have as a destination. And there are examples of this when many of the big retailers are now, they look a lot like Fred Siegel used to look 20 years ago, which Fred Siegel was a collection of little boutiques under one roof. And I think the big retailers, a lot of them have been moving that way, which is they're a collection of little brand shops. And so that gets interesting.
Yeah.
But I think it does change the footprint for retail. And I think that, what we're seeing these days is the most successful retailers now are not taking 100,000 square feet. They're taking 5,000 feet or 4,000 feet.
Yeah. And Brett, how do you think this crisis and kind of its immediate aftermath, how do you think it changes brokerage, right? The business of real estate brokerage. I mean, I read a lot about virtual viewings are kind of on the rise. And what's hard to figure out is that just a temporary thing that's just kind of a constraint we have today, or long-term, is that really how we think people will understand space? And I'm curious, obviously, the differences between residential and commercial, right? Because the sizes of the commitments are so different. So like, what do you think brokerage looks like a year from now?
So again, what has happened for this last 4 weeks is that the entire commercial brokerage business has been done remotely. So this is a situation where the dinosaurs have been forced to do what they said they would never do, right? They said they would never do a virtual showing. They would never do a Zoom call. They would never use CRM or all the applications we've built for them to use. They now have been faced with a dilemma, which is either use those things or go broke. And
right.
So they're using those things. Brokers are very facile. They're very smart. They know how to go to where the action is. And I think what this period of time has shown the brokerage community is you can get an awful lot done, more than you thought you could get done remotely. And so, to your point, virtual showings. There's no other way to do building inspections right now. Right. People are doing, they're doing things with Zoom and FaceTime and Salt Mine and these applications that they never would have tried before because they have to. And because they have to, they're able to try it with permission. In other words, the client can't say to them, I don't want to do it that way. Drive and meet me there.
Right.
It's the only way to get it done. So my guess is that what brokers are finding, just like other employees and other disciplines are finding, is these applications that companies invested in actually work really well. And they do fill the purpose. It is okay to do a virtual showing. It is okay to use DocuSign for every single document now. And this has been a forced adoption, but it's an adoption nonetheless. And I think that some of these things are going to stick. I don't know which, I don't know how, but I think that we're going to find, in our firm at least, we believe that the adoption of all the technologies that we've built for our brokers over the last 5 years, the adoption has been very slow going into the pandemic. It's very fast right now. And I think many of these are going to stick. So the brokerage business is going to be a much more virtual business.
Yeah, and just thinking that's true of so many industries. That's true in brokerage, but the the tailwinds this has put behind technology adoption and kind of SaaS services,
Amazing.
that are absolutely core, that are existential to a business like yours, is probably amazing. You probably achieved what would have happened over the course of 5 or 10 years in 60 days.
Well, we would have been begging our sales force every day. You've seen it firsthand, every single day, to use these technologies. We bought them, built them, and installed them.
Right.
And they were gathering dust. And we've been begging our employees to do it. Now they're begging us to remind them, how do I do that again? How does this application work?
Right.
But the good news about it is, as I said, brokers are it's a tough business they're in. And they're smart and they're agile. And so you bring that horse to water, it drinks the water and it loves the water and it will keep drinking the water. Right. So this, Adam, our CIO, who well, Adam Stanley and I were chatting about this the other day, we've accomplished in 4 weeks adoption we could not have done in 4 years.
Wow, that's really amazing. Well, Brett, thank you so much for joining me. This is obviously a really unique time to be connecting, but it's good to connect virtually. So thanks again.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, bye-bye.